All right, so today we are going to dive deep into the world of Charlie Bird Parker,
Bird Parker.
the saxophone G.O.A.T,
The G.O.A.T.
the greatest of all time. You hear that phrase everywhere these days, G.O.A.T, but it wasn't always so common.
Yeah, you're right. What's interesting is that it's, said just like the animal goat, it's believed to have taken off with the boxer Muhammad Ali, the greatest, and then rapper LL Cool J even named an album G.O.A.T back in 2000.
So from boxing rings to hip-hop, the idea of G.O.A.T really caught on.
Mm.
And in the world of jazz saxophone, that title undoubtedly belongs to Charlie Parker. What is it about his playing that set him apart?
To understand Parker's genius, you have to go back to his roots. Born in 1920 in Kansas City, he was surrounded by the sounds of blues-heavy swing, which was the popular jazz style at the time. Imagine young Charlie soaking up those influences.
I've heard he's a practice fanatic. Some say up to 15 hours a day. Is that just a musician's myth?
Well, that dedication is a big part of the story. He was driven to master the saxophone. There's this famous story about the Joe Jones cymbal incident. Parker was playing at a jam session, and drummer Joe Jones, a swing legend, wasn't impressed. He apparently tossed a cymbal at Parker to get him to stop playing.
Wow, that's harsh. What happened next?
It was a turning point. Parker was humiliated, but it forced him to rethink his approach. He retreated and practiced intensely, and that's where the bebop revolution began to take shape.
So how did this new style, bebop, actually come about? The story goes that it clicked for him while practicing the standard tune Cherokee.
That's right. Parker moves to New York City in 1939, a melting pot of musical influences. He's absorbing everything from the fiery piano playing of Art Tatum to the complex harmonies of classical composers like Stravinsky. All these ideas were swirling around in his head.
So it was a combination of his background in blues and swing, his relentless practice, and then these new influences he encountered in New York.
Exactly. And while jamming Cherokee with guitarist Billie Fleet, he has this breakthrough moment. Parker starts using what are called chromatic passing tones. Think of it like this. If you're walking up a staircase, those extra little steps between the main ones, that's kind of what chromatic notes do in music. They add unexpected twists and turns to the melody.
So instead of just playing the notes you'd expect, he's weaving in these extra notes, these surprises.
Exactly. He starts incorporating these chromatic passing tones along with higher notes from the chords called upper chord tones. It created a sound that was more dissonant, more angular, and very different from the smooth harmonies of swing.
That must have been pretty shocking to people used to swing.
It was. Bebop wasn't just a new style, it was a whole different way of thinking about jazz improvisation. In swing, the solos were mostly based on the melody of the song, but bebop took improvisation to a whole new level.
So how did this new approach to improvisation actually work? What made bebop so different?
Think of it like this in swing. Musicians were basically decorating the melody, adding ornaments and flourishes. With bebop, Parker and his contemporaries were deconstructing the harmony of the song, breaking it down into its basic building blocks, and then using those building blocks to create entirely new melodies on the fly. It was revolutionary.
I'm starting to see why they call him Bird. His musical mind was flying high.
His solos weren't just a bunch of notes. They were like spontaneous compositions full of intricate ideas and unexpected turns. It was mind-blowing to hear, especially for musicians steeped in the swing tradition.
And those early recordings for Savoy and Dial, that's where it all comes together.
Right? That's where you hear Parker's genius exploding onto the scene. The energy, the speed, the harmonic innovations. It was like a sonic earthquake that shook the jazz world to its core. We'll get into the specifics of those groundbreaking recordings in a bit. But first, let's delve into the technical brilliance behind those solos.
Okay, we've set the scene, this young musician in the heart of a musical revolution. But what actually made those solos so special? It wasn't just that he was playing fast, right?
Absolutely not. There's this misconception that bebop is all about speed. But it's so much more than that. Parker's true genius lies in how he used those chromatic passing tones and upper chord tones to create these incredibly sophisticated melodies.
Can you give us an example of that? I mean, something we could actually hear if we listened to one of his recordings.
Let's take Coco, one of his most famous compositions. It's based on Cherokee, that same tune where he had his bebop breakthrough. Now listen carefully to how he uses those chromatic notes. They're not just random. He's connecting them in a way that creates these smooth flowing lines. It's like he's taking you on a musical journey, but with these unexpected twists and turns along the way. That's what we call voice leading. It's a technique where he's making the different notes in his solo weave together seamlessly.
So it's like he's thinking about how each note leads to the next, creating a sense of flow, even when he's playing these incredibly complex harmonies.
Exactly. And it's not just about the individual notes, it's about how he groups them into phrases. Parker was a master of phrasing. He knew exactly when to hold back, when to let a note breathe, and when to unleash a torrent of sound.
It sounds like he was really thinking about the shape of his solos like a sculptor shaping clay.
That's a great analogy. He'd often introduce a short musical idea, a motif, and then develop it throughout the solo, transforming it in all sorts of ways. That's called motivic development. It gives his solos a sense of structure and coherence, even when he's improvising at breakneck speed.
Can you give us an example of motivic development? Is there a solo where we can actually hear that happening?
Listen to Parker's Mood, one of his most soulful ballads. You'll hear him introduce a simple phrase at the beginning, and then he keeps returning to it. But each time he changes it slightly, adding ornaments, changing the rhythm, playing it in a different key. It's like he's having a conversation with himself, using that musical motif to express different emotions.
I'm starting to understand the depth of his playing. It's more than just technical skill. It's about expressing ideas and emotions through those intricate melodies.
Precisely. And he could shift between those emotions so effortlessly. He could blaze through these fiery runs at lightning speed, and then he'd pull back and play something incredibly lyrical and tender.
It's that contrast that makes him so captivating, right? That blend of raw energy and sheer beauty.
You hit the nail on the head. There's a story that he could actually anticipate harmony changes before they happened. Is there any truth to that?
It sounds almost impossible, but many musicians who played with him swear it's true. He'd often resolve a chord in his solo before the band had even played it. It's like he had this sixth sense for where the music was going.
It speaks to his deep understanding of harmony and his ability to think several steps ahead. No wonder he influenced so many other jazz giants. John Coltrane spent hours transcribing Parker's solos, dissecting his phrasing and harmonic choices. And Miles Davis, another legend, incorporated Parker's innovations into his own playing and composing.
So you can hear Parker's influence in generations of jazz musicians. What are some other solos besides Coco and Parker's Mood that really showcase his genius?
Donna Lee is a must-listen. It's a technical tour de force full of those blazing fast arpeggios and complex chord changes. Then there's Yardbird Suite, which became a bebop anthem. It's a perfect example of his melodic inventiveness and his ability to craft solos that are both intellectually stimulating and emotionally resonant.
Okay, those going on my playlist. We've talked about his technique, his harmonic innovations, his use of voice leading and motivic development, but there's another element to his genius, his sound, his tone.
You're right. It wasn't just what he played, it was how he played it. Parker's sound was unique. It had this bright, almost piercing quality that cut through any band he played with.
What created that sound? Was it his saxophone, his mouthpiece, his reeds?
It was a combination of factors. Of course, his equipment played a role, but it was more about his embouchure, the way he used his mouth and breath to control the sound, and his articulation, the way he attacked and released each note.
So it's almost like a singer using their vocal cords and breath control to create a particular sound.
That's a great way to put it. Parker had this incredible precision in his articulation. Each note was crisp and clear, even when he was playing at blistering speeds. And then there's his use of space. Even in his fastest solos, he knew when to pause, when to let a phrase breathe.
So it's not just about playing a lot of notes, it's about knowing when not to play.
Exactly. Those moments of silence, those carefully placed pauses, create a sense of drama and tension. They make the music breathe. And that's what made Parker's playing so dynamic and exciting. It wasn't just a wall of sound, it was a conversation between sound and silence.
His playing really redefined what the saxophone could sound like, didn't it? It was a departure from the smoother, more mellow tone that was common in swing.
Absolutely. His sound was more aggressive, more assertive, more in your face. It reflected the energy and intensity of bebop itself, and it's had a lasting impact on generations of saxophonists.
But Parker's musical interests weren't limited to jazz, were they? He was also a big fan of classical music, especially composers like Stravinsky and Bartók.
That's right. He loved their complex harmonies and unconventional rhythms. You can hear those influences in some of his compositions like Repetition, which is actually based on a theme by Stravinsky.
That's fascinating. It shows his broad musical horizons, his willingness to draw inspiration from different genres.
He even had this ambition to bring jazz into the concert hall, to present it as a serious art form on par with classical music. And that led to the famous Charlie Parker with Strings recordings.
I've heard of those. They were pretty controversial, weren't they?
They were. Some jazz purists criticized them, accusing Parker of selling out by adding strings to his music. But others saw them as a groundbreaking fusion of jazz and classical, a way of expanding the possibilities of both genres.
What did those recordings actually sound like? Were they more jazz or more classical?
They were a unique blend of the two. Parker solos were still full of his trademark bebop brilliance, but they were surrounded by these lush string arrangements. Some of them were based on popular standards, but there were also original compositions like Just Friends and April in Terrace.
So he was trying to bridge the gap between two worlds, the improvisational world of jazz and the more structured world of classical music.
Exactly. And those recordings were actually quite successful. They introduced Parker to a wider audience and helped to pave the way for what later became known as third stream music, a movement that explicitly sought to merge jazz and classical.
I'm hearing that Parker was a true innovator, pushing the boundaries of jazz in so many ways.
Yeah.
But his life wasn't all about musical triumphs, was it? There was a darker side to his story as well.
You're right. Sadly, Parker's personal life was plagued by addiction and turmoil. The same intensity that fueled his musical brilliance also seemed to contribute to his self-destructive tendencies.
You're right. Sadly, Parker's personal life was plagued by addiction and turmoil. The same intensity that fueled his musical brilliance also seemed to contribute to his self-destructive tendencies.
It's a reminder that genius often comes at a price.
His relentless pursuit of perfection, his constant pushing of musical boundaries, it seemed to take a heavy toll on his mental and physical health.
Yeah.
Heroin was a major problem in the jazz world at that time. How much of a role did that play in his struggles?
Well, it's impossible to separate Parker's story from the context of his time. Heroin was readily available, and many musicians, including some of the greatest, fell victim to its grip.
So it was a cultural problem as much as a personal one.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue, and it's important not to oversimplify it. But there's no denying that Parker's addiction had a devastating impact on his life and his music.
It's heartbreaking to think about the contrast between his extraordinary musical mind and the chaos of his personal life.
Yeah, it's a tragic reminder that brilliance and vulnerability can coexist. There was his infamous arrest and time at Camarillo State Hospital. It's difficult to grasp how mental health was perceived back then, but that experience undoubtedly left a mark on him.
And then the devastating loss of his young daughter, Pri.
That loss absolutely shattered him. It's hard to imagine the pain he must have endured.
Despite all of this, he continued to play right, even in his final years.
Yes, his music was his lifeline. Even as his health declined dramatically, his playing remained masterful.
It's almost unbelievable that he died at just 34 years old.
It's a tragedy. When he passed, the coroner initially estimated him to be in his 50s or 60s. His body was that ravaged by addiction.
That's incredibly sad.
Yeah.
But his music, his legacy, it lives on. His impact on jazz and music in general is undeniable.
Absolutely. Parker's death sent shockwaves through the jazz world, but it also ignited an explosion of his influence. Musicians everywhere began studying his recordings, dissecting his solos, trying to unlock the secrets of his genius.
So even in death, he continued to shape the evolution of jazz.
His influence extends far beyond jazz, too. You can hear echoes of Parker in classical music, hip-hop, even electronic music. His innovative approach to harmony, rhythm, and improvisation continues to inspire musicians across genres.
What do you think modern musicians can still learn from Charlie Parker?
Oh, so much. He teaches us the importance of deep listening, of immersing ourselves in diverse musical styles. He shows us the power of pushing boundaries, of constantly seeking new ways to express ourselves through our instrument. And he reminds us that music is about more than just technical proficiency. It's about raw emotion, about connecting with something deeper within ourselves and sharing it with the world.
It's amazing to think that decades after his death, Charlie Parker is still considered the saxophone G.O.A.T. What a legacy.
Here's a final thought for you. Imagine if Parker had lived longer, had overcome his struggles. How much more music would he have created? What other boundaries would he have broken? What other musical worlds would he have revealed to us? It's a tantalizing question, one that underscores the enduring power and mystery of Charlie Parker's genius.
If you want to experience this genius for yourself, definitely check out some of his key albums, like Charlie Parker with Strings, Bird and Diz, Jazz at Massey Hall, Charlie Parker at Storyville, and the complete Savoy Dial sessions.
And don't forget about all the incredible musicians he collaborated with, like Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, Bud Powell, Thelonious Monk, Max Roach, and Machito.
Charlie Bird Parker, the saxophone G.O.A.T. An innovator, a revolutionary, a troubled soul who left behind a legacy of beauty and brilliance.
His music continues to inspire and challenge us, reminding us that the possibilities of human creativity are truly boundless.